Hello and welcome to the Majlis, Radio for Your Freedom Liberties Current Affairs podcast focusing on Central Asia. I'm Mohammed Tahir, the host of the Majlis podcast and Radio for Your Freedom Liberties media manager here in Washington, D.C. 10 years ago, almost these days, Kyrgyzstan's Osh region was a scene to Central Asia's worst interethnic conflict in its recent history, where as a result of clashes between Uzbek minority and Kyrgyz majority, which apparently started over the land distribution and unequal access to the economic and political power, the region has suffered massive property damages. Hundreds of people were lost their lives and thousands were displaced. The conflict clearly left deep wounds in society. On today's Majlis podcast, we are here to discuss what has been the legacy of the conflict for Kyrgyzstan, what changed in Osh, what healed, and what has not healed. To discuss all these, I am joined by Muzaffar Suleymanov, Eurasia Program Officer at Civil Rights Defenders, who is originally from Uzbekistan, Jasmine Kamran, human rights lawyer who specializes in Central Asia and is originally from Kyrgyzstan, Mehra Ritman, senior Central Asia researcher for Human Rights Watch, Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio for Europe, Radio Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Awazi. Welcome on board, colleagues. So it's been 10 years since the conflict, so maybe it's worth refreshing our memories on what we are talking about today. So Bruce, you were in the region those days. Maybe we can start with you. So please walk us through the events of those days in Osh and surrounding region.
Yeah, well, it started in the nighttime, of course. I was talking to both sides. It's really difficult to say exactly what started it. I mean, the area that it started in was somewhere down by a casino in downtown Osh, and it was also by a dormitory too. By the time I got there, it's already been going on for a few days. Lots of parts of the town were damaged. The Uzbek neighborhoods especially really kind of took a lot of burned buildings, a lot of barricades at first when I got there. There were police in some places. There were members of the armed forces in some places, but it was really kind of hit and miss all over the town. The mayor of the city, although he claimed to be an honest mediator, in my opinion, he did not seem to be an honest mediator in this one. You know, they finally did things under control a little bit. You know, we had hundreds of people dead, mostly Uzbeks, hundreds of thousands of people on the move across the border into Uzbekistan, about 70 or 80,000. But there was probably 200,000 that were backed up along the border on the Kyrgyz side, Uzbeks, that wanted to get out. You could see them walking along the road, women and children, headed toward the Uzbek border. I was there in June, and then I went back again in July, and it kind of separated the city. You know, the areas that everyone knew were Uzbek before, but you could walk in and out of, were suddenly more like internalized. They were not sealed off physically, but it was recognized that you were crossing from one side to another. And like I said, no one ever wanted to take responsibility for what happened there, either side. You know, you'd hear stories from the Kyrgyz side say that some people said, well, they wanted greater autonomy. They wanted to have an autonomous region within Kyrgyzstan. Had been moves to get things like more schools teaching in Uzbek and street signs in Uzbek, as well as in Kyrgyz. That had been happening. That's true. As far as autonomy, that seemed to stretch, and I tried the argument a couple times that if they were autonomous, who would support them?
Just one interruption here. When you are not talking, please keep your mics muted so that we have a quality sound coming into the studio here. Any other recollections? Anyone was around those days? Anything that you want to add to Bruce's comments about those early days of the conflict?
I guess I can add a couple of words,
Sure.
Mohammed.
Sure.
Although I was not physically there, but I was born and I grew up in Bishkek, capital of Kyrgyzstan. And after hearing about the events, I was really surprised at the sort of rate of the violence, how shocking it was, how outrageous it was, and probably indicative of the fact that when I was growing up in Bishkek, there always was that divide between North and South, cultural divide. Another thing that was striking at that time is that there was complete lack of government response, and we probably will get to that, but just my recollection of those times was that everyone was asking, where's the government? What is the effective and timely response of the security forces? What is happening? Who is going to be stopping this horrible horrible violence. So I guess I wasn't in the country, but certainly was very shocked by the events.
Mehrad, Muzaffar, any points from you? We will move on quickly to the other topics then.
Yeah, I could jump in quickly. This is Mira. Human Rights Watch was on the ground from the start. My colleague at the time was there when the clashes broke out, and I didn't make it until closer to the end of June, if I'm not mistaken. And my recollection mirrors what Bruce said about it, the aftermath of the violence or the burnt out houses and the palpable fear especially amongst ethnic Uzbek communities. I just wanted to mention that the Kyrgyz government invited an international inquiry into the events to establish a timeline. That established a timeline. And so I'm not sure that is contested, and it sets out a clear sort of point-by-point analysis of what happened when those first days. I think it's also important to note that while horrific crimes were committed by both Uzbeks and Kyrgyz over those days, that the ethnic Uzbeks endured the majority of casualties and destroyed homes. And as Jasmine was saying, that there was a question of the role of Kyrgyz authorities who either failed to prevent or stop violence once it erupted, and even some indications that military and police forces may have facilitated, knowingly or unknowingly, attacks on Uzbek neighborhoods.
Right. Then Muzaffar, quickly, anything from you?
Yes, sure. Back at the time in June 2010, I remember I wasn't on the ground. I haven't visited Kyrgyzstan since after graduating from the American University in 2004 and leaving for my further grad school studies. And at 2010, and I was working at the Committee to Protect Journalists in New York, and I do remember that how we have been monitoring the situation that started in April with the ousting of Bakiev and the attacks on the censorship of news websites. I think Fergana news website was among the few that he ordered to block inside the country during the last weeks of his presidency. And then the attacks on the Uzbek TV stations, and they're shut down during the riots and ethnic clashes. I'm talking about Mezon TV and Osh TV, both Uzbek language TV stations which have never recovered and whose owners have, with their families, have been forced to out of the country, and they were prosecuted in absentia. And obviously, I do remember reporting on arrest of Azinjan Askarov, who was jailed on June 15, 2010. I do remember, though, being outside of the country, following closely, and also trying to assist the evacuation of two ethnic Uzbek journalists who have reached out to us, told us that they were hiding, that they were being targeted both for being journalists and also for their ethnicity. And so I was trying to scramble how to get them out of their locations. So,
right. You know, when you guys were talking, I was taking some notes. So I hear two very clear, distinct points here. One is the developments leading to those events. And the second is what followed next. Maybe we start with the later question. I mean, what followed next? I mean, there has been lots of questions about the role of the authorities, the role of the security services in Kyrgyzstan, whether they were incompetent or maybe complicit. So the events that Muzaffar was detailing about the attacks on the journalists, maybe on Uzbek language television channels, how one can explain that, the harassments that followed after those events?
Well, I'll comment a little bit. At least I couldn't speak to the motivations of harassment, but I can certainly fill in some details about on the ground. One of the problems that you got to remember is that it was unfortunate that at the time all this happened, the people who were in charge of law enforcement and security were overwhelmingly ethnic Kyrgyz, because that's who was mostly in the army and mostly in the police. Now, you know, to give you an example of the difference, when I got there, the first day I got there was one Uzbek neighborhood, and they'd kind of barricaded themselves in, but there was a tank in front of it too, and it was being manned by Afghansi, because the Kyrgyz government wasn't ready for it, and they'd called up Afghan veterans if they were willing to come and volunteer to go. And so that tank was manned by a Russian and a Tatar, and the Uzbek people that were in the neighborhood living behind that felt safer with them being there for obvious reasons than other people in Uzbekistan whose neighborhoods were nominally being guarded by ethnic Kyrgyz troops from the army. So that was one of the big problems there, and one of the reasons why the Uzbeks found it much harder to get protection at that moment.
That's interesting. Anything, Mira, you would like to add?
Well, if we're talking about the aftermath of the events, in terms of the response of the authorities when they began investigations and trials into what happened in those days, Human Rights Watch documented massive sweep operations that resulted in arbitrary arrests, and that these operations disproportionately targeted ethnic Uzbeks, that in the context of the investigations, there were widespread claims of ill treatment and torture, and that law enforcement offers routinely subjected people detained in connection with the June violence to torture. They were almost completely uninvestigated. I want to reiterate that point, that even though it was routine and widespread, accountability for torture in the context of the June 2010 event trials and investigations was almost non-existent. There were also reports of people who were detained having to pay bribes under threat of criminal investigation or to be released. So again, we see the role of law enforcement not responding adequately. We also documented how there was selective and skewed prosecution of ethnic Uzbeks, in the context of which there were serious violations of fair trial standards. So I talked about allegations of ill treatment and torture, but another marker, or something that was very common in the case of administration of justice for the June 2010 events, was harassment and attacks on lawyers and hostility in the courtroom, and the inability or unwillingness of the judiciary and, in some cases, law enforcement that had been called ostensibly to maintain order in the courtroom, failing to act. Human Rights Watch has written many press releases about violence in the courtroom. Azimjan Askarov's case is one that comes to mind. Another case of an ethnic Uzbek, Muhammad Bizarukov. I monitored several trials that his case went on for 4 years in the judiciary, and I monitored several trials. And every time that I was there, the relatives of the ethnic Kyrgyz man who he was accused of his actions led to this ethnic Kyrgyz man's death, were shouting insults and throwing things at him and shouting. They threw a shoe and a glass in his cage, and it was just such a hostile environment. Yeah. There was other cases where people physically attacked lawyers and physically attacked defendants. So there was a breakdown of law and order across the board, from the beginning of investigations all the way through trials, where law enforcement and the judiciary have still to date have to answer for. Unfortunately, we have not seen that the Kyrgyz authorities, the government, receptive to those calls to look into establishing justice for all of those violations that we at Human Rights Watch and many others documented in the aftermath of the violence.
So speaking of justice, maybe Jasmine, you could jump in here. I mean, you must have lots of interactions with the Kyrgyz authorities, especially with the people representing their justice system. When you talk to them, how they try to explain the role that authorities played in those days, what they did and why they did it?
I just wanted to mention that I personally did not monitor cases of those events, but what I can tell is that failure of the security forces to timely interfere and stop the violence, sadly, is not surprising. And the reason is that at that time, security forces, during the President Bakiyev's time, the security forces were built in a way they would have sort of the personal loyalties to the president. So to say that the Kyrgyz government had established effective security forces would be inaccurate, to say the least. Overall, I just wanted to echo Mira's comments about legal system in general, is that at that time, it's still now, unfortunately, that legal system is going through sort of transition period, if you will, trying to adopt new legal concepts, institutes, and traditions. There are many other factors that are rooted in the functioning of effective legal systems, such as corruption, lack of judicial independence, geographic isolation, low level of respect for the rule of law. I specifically wanted to mention the situation with treatment of lawyers. under the Kyrgyz law, legal system in Kyrgyzstan should be adversarial, meaning that every participant in the courtroom in general in legal process have equal right. But in reality, unfortunately, the system functions in a way where prosecutors still have a lot of power. Whatever case prosecutors are bringing to the court, judges, I wouldn't say automatically, but more likely would accept the prosecutor's case. And also another important factor is that overall lack of respect for the rule of law is actually penetrates all sort of level of the society, starting with the courtroom setting, starting with the citizens' participation in the process. We've seen attacks not only on the defense attorneys in the courtroom, but also on prosecutors and judges. And it speaks to the fact that people do not realize the rights and protections that every subject in the courtroom have. So when people feel that justice is not served to the way how they see, they take, I guess, the justice in their own hands. And unfortunately, again, the laws on the papers are still protecting rights of lawyers, but in practice, those laws are not implemented. And talking about general practical aspects, it all comes down to implementation of the rules and processes and procedures, and sadly, that's not the case.
Okay, so Jasmine was explaining the way the justice system works in today's Kyrgyzstan. Taking back the discussion to the events of 2010, the other leg of my question was that things did not reach to the boiling point just in one day. So there must have been some signs leading up to the actual unrest in June 9th. I mean, how did the authorities miss those signs?
All right, well, I guess I could start with that. I mentioned right before that Bakiyev's government had just been thrown out. He'd fled like 9 weeks before or something like that. So you had an interim government that was trying to get control over the situation. And the 2010 revolution was very different than the 2005 revolution. The 2005 revolution, the actual protests started in the south and spread throughout the country. The 2010 revolution happened in a couple places in the north. It was very quick, and it was over. And when I went down to the south, when Bakiyev was down in Tahir before he fled Kyrgyzstan for good, you could people then you could see they were mystified. I mean, the revolution had happened and they hadn't had any part or any say in it at all. So the government was trying to get its act together. They had whatever connections they had to people in the south. I don't know. It's interesting that the current president was the governor of Osh at that time. So they were trying to get their alliances all set up again after there'd been this rift in really the Kyrgyz people, because some supported Bakiyev and some supported the interim government that came after that. So how would they know this was going to happen? Now, there was warning signs that there was a lot of minor violence that was going on between this. A group of Uzbeks, for instance, had burned down one of the Bakiyev family homes in the south. But unfortunately, it went into this routine. There were very, very small incidents. A few people hurt, maybe, and things like that. And everyone kind of figured that this was just a phase that everyone had to work through. It wouldn't get any bigger than involving several dozen people, and it would finally burn itself out sooner or later. But it ended up turning into this instead.
So what you are saying is that this was not, at least in the level which happened, this was not expected?
I can't see how the government could have would have known in advance. I mean, they should have known there was a lot of problems down there and maybe paid a lot more attention. I don't think anyone could have anticipated it would have gone so far so fast.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruce. Time flies when we are in the studios. So let's.
Can I quickly jump in as well?
Sure, very quickly.
Couple of things to note. First, a correction regarding what Bruce has said. It wasn't the Uzbeks who burned one of the Bakiyev's houses. It was a joint mob of Kyrgyz and Uzbeks. That needs to be clarified. And then what I wanted to say also, the problem here is that in Kyrgyzstan, back in 2010, and I would say that it started probably from 2005, the failure of the authorities to institute the rule of law turned into the rule of mob. And it is the rule of mob that has led to all of that in 2010 that we see. And we continue seeing it right now. Like when the March 8th protest rally in Bishkek was dispersed by a mob of people, right? And you continue seeing it right now, where you have the mob coming here and there and trying to threaten the authorities mob coming to Askarov's courtroom and saying if he's released, we're going to continue those pogroms and stuff. That's a big problem in Kyrgyzstan. The rule of law has never been introduced and institutionalized. I also wanted to mention really quickly that the document which Mira has mentioned in the very beginning, the Kyrgyz Inquiry Report, it was conducted by an independent expert whom Roza Atumbayeva, then the president, has invited. I don't think the Kyrgyz government has studied that report and made any kind of conclusions or followed up on any of the recommendations, including on the participation of the army and the police in the riots and the killings.
Okay, we will expand on that a little bit later. Though, it wasn't, I guess, the first incident in this part of the country involving interethnic clashes, but considering what followed next after 2010 events, what has been the legacy of this specific conflict for Kyrgyzstan? What changed in Osh? What healed and what has not healed yet? Let's continue the discussion talking about these and many other questions very shortly. First, let me recap the debate that today on the Majlis podcast, I am joined by Muzaffar Suleimanov, Euro-Asia Program Officer at Civil Rights Defenders, Jasmine Cameron, Human Rights Lawyer, Mira Ritman, Senior Central Asia Researcher for Human Rights Watch, Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlak Owazi. I, Mohammed Tahir, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberties Media Manager and host of the Majlis podcast here in Washington, D.C., and we are discussing the legacy of Osh interethnic conflict. Welcome back, colleagues. So, yes, it's been 10 years since the conflict. Maybe let's start with you, Jasmine. What are some of the tales that you are still bothered by, the way it happened, the way what followed?
I guess I probably will circle back to the legal system and the government response, lack of the government response. And that actually goes to, I guess, the root of the problem, which I guess lies, we need to see sort of a larger picture of why it happened. And sadly, it happened because of the, resource sharing problems, poor economy in the region or in the country in general, unemployment and corruption, the fact that the legal system or generally rule of law has been struggling for many years now is a reality, sad reality. On the other hand, I also wanted to sort of argue a little bit that it's just been not a long period for independent country to be recognized as an established state. It takes a lot longer than 20 or 30 years for a true legal system to sort of function independently and effectively, that many international community, foreign governments, Kyrgyz government, all were working to establish rule of law, independent judicial system for a long time. The government, Kyrgyz government, obviously expressed interest and willingness to improve the judicial system. But what I would like to underline that it's not sort of an easy overnight success, say that rule of law is established and all the systems are functioning. It's a long process. But at the same time, still ask difficult questions from the government and from the structures. And we are right to request and expect the government authorities to investigate those cases, to prosecute the perpetrators, to make sure that it's never going to happen again.
So the way...
Can I just sort of push back a little bit at what Jasmine was saying about it taking a long time for the rule of law to take hold? I agree. I don't take issue with that in principle. But I think when we're talking about the scale of impunity for torture and ill treatment that we saw in the aftermath of the June 2010 events, where we see the blatant injustice regarding Azimjan Askarov's continued imprisonment, these are cases where it would take very little on the part of the authorities to take concerted action to right egregious wrongs. And we're not seeing that. So while you have a sort of the system that takes time to be established, there are immediate steps the government could have already taken and still should take now to address violations that have occurred and that have affected real people's lives in Kyrgyzstan today. And now, having said that, your question has slipped my mind. Can you ask me?
Mira, I had another question to ask, but I think you partially answered my question. But your comments raised another question in my mind. That is about Azimjan Askarov. I mean, by now he's an old man. It's been 10 years since he's in jail. What problem the Kyrgyz authorities have with this man? I mean, what's stopping them to get him released from the jail?
One could speculate quite a bit about why not, whether it's concerns about nationalist factions in Kyrgyzstan having issue with his release, whether it's a genuine belief that he was guilty of the crime, whether it's seen as bowing to Western pressure. But the fact is that regardless of the concerns, there is a man sitting in prison for 10 years, and there is an independent UN Human Rights Committee ruling that has found that he was arbitrarily arrested, that he was tortured, and has called for his immediate release. And Kyrgyzstan is party to the UN mechanism and has a responsibility then to take action on that ruling. And it hasn't for many years now. So I can appreciate that maybe there are people that are not entirely sure how to mitigate the sentiments and the fallout that would occur if Azimjan Askarov were released. But they need to release him. They should release him. And every day that he continues to sit in jail is an injustice. And I hope that President Jayinbekov takes heed of Kyrgyzstan's responsibility to implement the Human Rights Committee's decision.
Okay, so let's bring this discussion down to day-to-day life of people in Osh. I don't know which of you visited last Osh, but speaking of the legacy of the developments in Osh back in 2010, how much those conflict is still a factor in today's Osh in terms of the inter-ethnic relations?
When preparing for today's talk, since I did reach out to our partners in Kyrgyzstan, I'm not going to say where, who, and where. My question to them was the same. Like, what can you tell me about the situation in the south of Kyrgyzstan now, 10 years after? Has anything changed? Has the government done anything to fix the situation and to address the problems? And the answer was no. The discrimination still exists. What Bruce was mentioning, that back in 10 years ago, there were not many ethnic Uzbek policemen. They confirmed that to me today, that yes, in the south of Kyrgyzstan, 99% of law enforcement agencies are staffed by ethnic Kyrgyz. And what they told me is that there is not a single ethnic Uzbek judge in the south of Kyrgyzstan. The only Uzbek language media outlet is radio station in Timak, which leaves majority of the regional population seeking news in Uzbek language from a neighboring country, from Uzbekistan, for 10 years. And Uzbekistan was not a democratic country where the media was independent. They were basically consuming Uzbek propaganda for 10 years. Another thing about the injustices, they still exist. What partners told me, 47 people received life sentences in connection to the Osh events, to those events. All of them are ethnic Uzbek. In the cases where two parties were victims, ethnic Kyrgyz or ethnic Uzbeks, when it comes to destruction of property, burning of houses or businesses, they told me that in the cases of ethnic Kyrgyz, justice was solved. There was some sort of either criminal cases launched and brought to an end, or the reparations were paid, damages were paid, nothing for the Uzbeks. As Mira has said, it is important that for those grave injustices, the government actually acts. It is important that the injustices in Azimjan Askarov's case are addressed. And it's really important also to stress here the role of the media, so that when reporting on those cases, when reporting on Askarov's case, and what I have noted, that particular radio stations, when reporting on the UN Human Rights Committee's rule, have been omitting the demands of the independent jury. They were omitting the first three demands: release of Azimjan Askarov, paying him reparation, and quashing his conviction. What they were reporting on for all these years, that the UN Human Rights Committee has asked for his retrial.
Muzaffar, thank you very much for that. Bruce, let me bring you in here. So, what is stopping Kyrgyzstan from taking actions to correct those steps? It's not just we are talking about this. It's been written in UN has been recommending to Kyrgyzstan to take certain steps, and there are Human Rights Watch and the other NGOs put out recommendations. What is stopping the authorities to take steps on that? They don't believe in what the reports are saying, or they have some other excuses. What is that?
Well, Mira laid out a lot of reasons why this is possible. Let's start with, don't they believe the reports or not? I cannot remember the gentleman's name. He was a Finnish guy, and he was leading the UN investigation, I believe, right?
Kimmo Kiljunen is his name.
Thank you very much. He led the investigation that found a lot of the things that we've been talking about, that the violence had disproportionately targeted the Uzbeks. They were the biggest victims and stuff. And he was declared persona non grata after the report came out. As far as I know, that's still in effect. So he can't go back to the country. That's how badly they took it, the Kyrgyz government. Is it something to do with nationalism? I don't know. I would say that certainly nationalism is a bigger problem in Kyrgyzstan today than it was prior to June 2010. And you can see all kinds of examples of why that's true. The joke about the horse sausage that they eat out there and stuff, and they drag that guy in. The jokes about that someone made disparaging remarks about the kalpak, the national hat and stuff, and that was met with, it's already got to that level where it's like, don't criticize us, all right, at all. But on top of that, I mentioned, the governor of Osh Oblast, Osh province at that time was Jayinbekov, Sorunbay Jayinbekov, who's now the president of the country. The mayor of Osh had a very strange role in this. I could never figure out exactly what. I interviewed him. It was clear that he was up to something, but, you couldn't pin him down on that. And, of course, he fled the country. He was even a candidate in 2015 elections, strangely. You would think that if you were the governor of a province, Jayinbekov would have had to know something about this. Who was responsible, what the plan was. It wouldn't have been hard. You can't miss something like that when you're the head of Oblast. And so if you're going to start opening up, all these closed caskets, whatever, from the, 10 years ago, then sooner or later his name is going to turn up. And who knows who else.
Can I jump in quickly to just add an addendum to what Bruce said?
Sure, very quickly, please.
I think that the government position, even some years ago, when I was still there and could be there and had government meetings, was that the situation in the south has been addressed. There is peace, and it's time to move on. And any efforts to sort of reopen those questions was met with almost hostility. The authorities took some steps. They established a state agency on interethnic relations that has been working since 2013. But I think there's concerns that it was a box-ticking exercise, because when you talk to people about their knowledge of the work of this agency, and like Muzaffar, I reached out to a friend in Osh to ask, she doesn't know where the representative office is in Osh. She says the people she knows doesn't know that it exists. This is the agency that's tasked with receiving complaints about interethnic relations. So, I think there are still things that the government can do today to ensure that we don't see another outbreak of violence in the future, based on some of the steps that they've already taken, by improving information flow, by making things accessible. This is beyond accountability for justice measures, but just talking about addressing interethnic sort of reconciliation efforts. I'd like to see it as an opportunity for the government to take those recommendations on board and do something that's more meaningful than just setting up an agency that people don't know about. In December, last point promised right now is that they invited the special rapporteur on minority issues, and he's going to come out with another set of recommendations for the authorities to take on to consider. And if they want a visit of a special rapporteur to be a meaningful exercise, the government, the authorities need to take heed of those recommendations and recognize that the information that he was getting is that people in Osh still have grievances and still feel that they are, that they don't have the same rights and freedoms that their Kyrgyz counterparts have. And that's important for the government to hear and to address head on.
You said there are still grievances. How much of attention is there today? I'm just trying to picture the future.
Well, again, based on some of the outreach that I've done to people in southern Kyrgyzstan, there's obviously not the kind of tensions that existed in the immediate aftermath of the June 2010 events. But I think that the question of ethnicity comes up in ways you don't expect. So, for example, the example that I was given was at the bazaar where butavom conflict, just a regular sort of exchange becomes one in which insults are still hurled that are on the basis of ethnicity or accusations of you should go back to where you came from. So that plays out, and that creates a sense of fear that hasn't gone away entirely for the ethnic Uzbek community. I think there's also the issue that Muzaffar was speaking about earlier, that as long as there isn't representation in law enforcement, in judiciary, in government, local government, that there's going to be a fear that rights are not going to be protected the same, given what has happened in Osh 10 years ago.
Just on that, Muzaffar, maybe you'd like to jump in here. Kyrgyz and ethnic Uzbeks, they live in those places, in those streets together as neighbors, as relatives. When there have been interethnic marriages and all these kind of friendships were going on, any of those things are coming back, has come back? What's the atmosphere there today?
Well, here's the thing. When it comes to justice, and that's what the people whom I spoke to today, they told me that those grievances, they still exist. Although there is no open conflict because everybody is afraid of that. When it comes to, for example, minor violations and police dealing with that or law enforcement dealing with that, you would see that, and that's what I was told today by somebody who lives in southern Kyrgyzstan. They told me that an ethnic Uzbek would have more chances of being harassed by law enforcement than ethnic Kyrgyz. And they would fear to bring any kind of legal action against their harassers and would prefer to participate in corruption by basically bribing somebody to shut down the case against them.
Is it worse compared to prior 2010?
Well, again, it's difficult to say and to comment on that when you sit in Stockholm and you don't have access to the streets of Osh or Jalalabad.
Right.
Mohammed, if I could say that, before 2010, there were also grievances that helped bring about the events of June 2010. So I'd like to think that the marker for peace and harmony for southern Kyrgyzstan is a more concerted effort on the part of the government right now to address, to go out and understand what are the problems still, but that requires the authorities in Kyrgyzstan to acknowledge that there are problems still and that there is some level of fear in the community and to actually engage, as opposed to just saying that everything is fine because it's fine and that's it. And that's what we would like to see.
There are so many things to talk about this, and even 10 years after those events, but fortunately we need to wrap up the discussion very soon here. Maybe just a very last and quick points from each of you. So this is the situation, it's nothing to be called normal, but life goes on. So where our eyes should be going forward on how things develop in this region? Let's start with you, Bruce.
I'm not confident that there's going to be any justice anytime soon for all the people that suffered out there, that's for sure. But what I would say that I think is a lot more hopeful is that, I've been going there since 1992. And 9 weeks before this stuff happened again, when we were wrapping up the Bakiev thing, I was sitting at a table at a restaurant right by the mosque on Masaliev Street with an Uzbek, a Kyrgyz, and a Tajik. We were all having dinner and having a great time together. I know that the people have been able to get along in the past. And so I'm hopeful that will be the case again pretty soon. And I have not been back since 2015, but I would be interested to see what it's like now that Mirziyoyev is the president of Uzbekistan, because better relations with Uzbekistan can only help the situation in southern Kyrgyzstan, I'm thinking. And I hope that, the friendship that's been developing there will continue to grow, and that they can start living like they did most of the time I've been in Osh, instead of what's been happening in the last 10 years.
Yeah, right. Muzaffar, it's a kind of tense region. Is there anything good there that we should be hopeful going forward? Where your eyes will be to determine, are we getting out of this or we are still hanging there?
Well, unfortunately, situation on the ground, especially in Kyrgyzstan right now, is not quite pretty. but there is always hope that on Monday, Azimjon Askarov's lawsuit will be accepted by the government, and the lawsuit on Kyrgyz government's failure to implement the UN Human Rights Committee's ruling for his release. That the government will seize this and will understand that this is the right way forward, that they need to release him, number one, and that they need to start acting by addressing all the injustices committed against all other Uzbeks in the region. And that they will extend, that the government will understand that human rights organizations, that NGOs whom the parliament currently targeting with their new bill are friends of the nation, that they are working to address many problems that the government cannot address because of the lack of the resources. And that they stop harassing the NGOs, journalists, and human rights defenders.
On that,
this is my hope.
On that, Muzaffar, is there anything the ethnic Uzbeks, minority Uzbeks can do to help the authorities to speed up this normalization process?
They can participate in that, in the life of the nation, as they have been doing.
Anything more than that?
I'm sure that they can revive, they would be happy to revive ethnic Uzbek media. They need a chance.
Okay, Jasmine, very quick point from you. So where your eyes will be going forward when you look into Osh, post-conflict situation there?
Sure. I mean, generally events like that, what happened in Osh, leave long-lasting wounds. And I guess one of the ways to heal those wounds is to make sure that there's accountability and justice. But, I mean, we talked about it a little bit. The process of reconciliation is not just happens by itself. Obviously, there should be efforts on many sides, government, civil society, citizens. I also want to draw attention to bigger aspects such as fighting corruption, improving rule of law, working on independence of the judiciary. All of those factors are going to be really important in ensuring that events like that is not going to happen in the future, and make sure that obviously international community is involved and continue its work on monitoring, on making sure that the government is being asked very difficult questions, making sure that international standards are being complied and accepted in Kyrgyzstan and implemented. Again, implementation is the key in providing rights and for the citizens.
Right. Thank you very much, Jasmine. Very quick and final note, Amira, from you.
Accountability is essential for securing long-term stability and reconciliation. And all of the other sort of efforts in the meantime that the government has taken, which are important steps, are just steps. And until they address head-on the serious breaches and violations of rights that took place in the context of the events themselves and the aftermath of the events, that there's going to be questions about long-term stability and reconciliation and justice. So I hope 10 years on that this is a topic and an issue that gets the government's attention again and is not just put aside because it's expedient for them to do so.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Mira Ritman, Senior Central Asia Researcher for Human Rights Watch. Also, big thanks goes to Muzaffar Suleymanov, Eurasia Program Officer at Civil Rights Defenders. Muzaffar is originally from Uzbekistan. Jasmine Cameron, human rights lawyer who specializes in Central Asia. And Jasmine is originally from Kyrgyzstan. And Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Central Asia blog, Kishlog Awazi. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this is from me, Mohammed Tahir, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's media manager and host of the Majlis podcast here in Washington, D.C. Until next week, bye-bye.